On her birthday, my daughter looked me in the eyes and said, "You can come, but don't expect to sit at the main table." That was the invitation. No warmth, no love, just boundaries. It had been years since I'd seen her. Truly seen her, not in passing texts, not filtered through obligation. Years since I heard her say, "Dad," without bitterness curling behind it. So when the envelope arrived, cream-colored, expensive, impersonal, I held it like it might burn me. My name, handwritten in a way that almost looked forged, stared back like a test I wasn't ready for. I read the words twice. "You're welcome to attend the celebration. Not we want you there. Not I miss you. Just tolerated presence. Still, hope does strange things to a man." I went to my closet and pulled out the same pressed white shirt I wore to her graduation, the one she never thanked me for funding. I polished my old brown shoes, the ones she used to clomp around in when she was a little girl, pretending to be just like Dad. I even bought a ribbon for the modest gift I'd prepared, a photo frame, wood-carved. Inside, a picture of us when she was 5, asleep on my chest, her hand clutching my thumb like it was the whole world. I stood in front of the mirror longer than I should have, trying to see what had changed. When did I become the man she'd rather not claim? I drove to her house in silence. The city buzzed with birthday lights and fake cheer, but inside my car there was only the steady thump of a heart that had been bruised by too many silences. The moment I pulled up, I knew I didn't belong. Luxury cars lined the driveway. Music drifted through the open windows, expensive, curated, cold. Her house was large, glowing, perfect. Nothing about it said, "home." I rang the doorbell. It took a while. When the door finally opened, she stood there in a navy silk dress, hair pinned like a celebrity, lips curled into a smile too polished to be real. For 1 second, I thought maybe she'd hug me. But instead, she glanced at her watch and said, "You're early." I wasn't. "Come in, Dad," she said, voice tight. And as I stepped into the grand hallway filled with perfume, strangers' laughter, and art that cost more than I earned in a year, I felt it. The distance. The decision. She hadn't invited me to be part of it. She invited me to be somewhere in it. And as I took off my coat and handed it to someone who looked startled that I wasn't another CEO, I realized this wasn't a homecoming. This was a warning. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Please share with us in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your own life? If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe and share it. That's how you help us grow and keep telling these powerful stories. Now, let's continue. The driveway was filled with cars that gleamed like mirrors. Polished, spotless, expensive. You could tell who mattered here just by their parking spot. As I stepped out of my car, the same one I'd used to drive her to school in the rain, the one with a cracked dashboard and fading seat fabric, I felt the quiet sting of contrast. It wasn't just that I didn't fit in, it was that I wasn't supposed to. The front yard was lit, like a wedding. Strings of lights floated over manicured hedges, and tall vases with white flowers stood at the entrance like silent guards. Through the large windows, I could see the laughter. It bounced off crystal glasses, echoed in rooms filled with applause and approval. Strangers smiled at one another like they belonged, like they knew they were part of something curated, perfect, staged. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, hand hovering near the doorbell, questioning if I was about to walk into a celebration or a reminder. Then I pressed it. The chime echoed. A long pause followed. I waited, adjusted my shirt, brushed invisible dust off my shoulder. That ache in my chest, the one I thought I'd buried years ago, came crawling back like it never left. Not a sharp pain. Just that slow, steady weight of knowing you're being tolerated, not welcomed. Finally, the door opened. She stood there, my daughter, dressed in elegance, glowing in the kind of way magazines capture. The perfume she wore was unfamiliar. Her smile was too tight, too practiced. Her eyes flicked past me before landing reluctantly on mine. "Dad, you're early," she said. I wasn't. I was exactly on time. But I nodded as if I'd made the mistake, as if I was sorry for being eager to see her again. She didn't hug me, didn't say she was glad I came, just stepped aside, holding the door open like I was another delivery she hadn't ordered but couldn't refuse. Inside, the house felt like a showroom. White walls, marble floors, candles lit in every corner. Expensive, impersonal, cold. My footsteps felt too loud, my shoes too worn. I passed by a table stacked with gifts wrapped in silk ribbons and glossy paper. Nothing there looked handmade. Nothing there looked like effort from the heart. Just price tags with pretty disguises. She didn't ask how I was. Didn't ask if I'd eaten. She just pointed toward the hallway and began walking ahead of me without looking back. I followed. Through laughter, through clinking glasses, past faces that glanced but didn't greet, past a grand dining table set for 20, with name cards written in gold, none of which bore my name. And in that moment I understood I wasn't early. I was unnecessary. But still, I walked in, because sometimes the people who raise the walls are left standing outside of them. The moment I crossed the threshold into the main room, it was as if the temperature changed. Warm laughter turned to curious silence, and every eye seemed to follow me, not out of recognition but hesitation. People paused mid-sentence. Wine glasses hovered just above lips. Conversations took on a different shape, quieter, guarded. Some of them I knew, men I once welcomed into our home when she was a teenager. Women who'd borrowed my tools or waved politely at school events. But time had dusted over those memories. Or maybe shame had. Not a single one said my name. Not even a nod of acknowledgement. They looked through me like I was part of the decor but in the wrong place. And she, my daughter, didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did. Maybe she counted on it. She kept walking, and I followed her like a shadow that didn't belong in the light. We passed the long dining table. Candles glowed down the center like a river of fire. Silverware gleamed under the chandelier. Every chair was filled. The air smelled of roasted lamb and white truffle. Tastes I could never afford, never cared for. At each seat, name cards sat folded like invitations to a life I was not part of. And just above that table, a wall of family portraits. Professional, glossy, curated. Her husband, their son, them on boats, them in Tuscany, them beneath trees too perfect to be real. Frame after frame, and not a single one of me. Not the man who held her when she had nightmares. Not the one who stayed awake 3 nights in a row when she had the flu. Not the man who taught her how to ride a bike and watched her fall and fall and fall until she flew. I kept my eyes forward. She turned a corner. We passed the guest bathroom, a side hall, a pantry bigger than my first kitchen, and then she stopped in front of a door I hadn't noticed before. She opened it. The kitchen. Stainless steel. Cold counters. No warmth. No laughter. The hum of a fridge. The clink of dishes in the sink. The cook glanced up and gave a polite smile, confused more than anything. She turned to me, still avoiding my eyes. "You'll be more comfortable here," she whispered, as if comfort had anything to do with it. She placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. It felt like punctuation, not affection. And then she was gone. Gone, back to her party. Back to her world. Back to the version of her life where I was a ghost behind the curtain. I stood there, staring at the empty stools by the island, then slowly moved toward the far end of the room, near the dish rack, and sat down. It was the kind of chair meant for 10-minute rests, not hours. But it didn't matter. Because this was where she thought I belonged. I looked around the kitchen. Everything was pristine. Labels faced outward. Cookbooks never opened. A place not for meals, but for show. I wondered if she even remembered how I used to cook eggs with smiley faces on them every Sunday. Or how we'd laugh in our old kitchen, small and messy, but warm. Always warm. Now here I was, alone. A guest in the back of the house I helped make possible. No plate. No toast. No family. Just me. And the quiet hum of a life that had left me behind. From the corner of the kitchen, I watched the evening unfold through the open doorway like a play I wasn't cast in. The sound of celebration drifted in waves. Champagne corks popping, cutlery chiming against porcelain, bursts of laughter that rose and fell like music I once knew the words to. Every so often, a waiter would glide past the kitchen entrance, a silver tray in one hand, champagne flute in the other, headed toward a world where names were remembered and seats were assigned. None of them looked at me, and I didn't expect them to. I sat still, back straight, hands resting on my knees, like I was waiting for instructions that would never come. At first, I told myself maybe they'd forgotten. Maybe someone would come in any minute with a plate and a soft apology. Maybe she'd realize what this looked like, what it felt like. But time has a way of telling the truth. 10 minutes, 20, 40, still nothing. I watched as another waiter passed, this time carrying lamb so tender it nearly fell from the bone. The scent reached me, warm and slow, curling into my chest like a memory I didn't want. And just behind him, a tray of desserts, small, delicate things with gold leaf and sugared tops. Celebration food, luxury dressed as affection, still nothing for me. So I stood, quietly, not wanting to make a sound, walked over to the sink, ran the cold water, and filled a glass from the tap. I drank it slowly, like it mattered, like it could settle the storm behind my ribs. My throat was dry, but not from thirst. There's a kind of dryness that comes from not being seen, from watching your place at the table be handed to someone else. I opened a lower cabinet, found a half-eaten loaf of bread, likely meant for staff, wrapped loosely in a towel. I tore a piece. No butter, no warmth, just something to chew, something to remind my body that I was still here, even if no one else noticed. That was my dinner, not because there wasn't enough food, but because there wasn't enough love. I returned to my stool by the dish rack and sat again. Every now and then I could hear someone toast her, voices rising, to the strongest woman we know, to someone who built her life from scratch, to our beautiful, unstoppable host. I smiled, a small, broken smile, because I knew what she hadn't built from scratch. She built from sacrifice. Mine. The overtime hours, the frozen dinners while I paid her tuition, the nights I stayed awake worrying how to cover her rent without letting her know. The years I went without, so she could have. But none of that made it to the speeches. None of that sat on the table in crystal bowls. My legacy, it seemed, had been reduced to a quiet man in a kitchen with a crust of bread and a glass of tap water. And still, I stayed. Not because I was hungry, but because a father never truly stops hoping, even when the table is full and his seat is in the shadows. The kitchen door creaked open slowly, and for a moment I thought maybe someone had remembered. Maybe she'd sent someone to bring me in, to say it was all a mistake, that no one puts their father by the dish rack while strangers drink toasts above linen napkins. But it wasn't her. It was a man, older, maybe my age, wearing a gray suit that looked a little too warm for the room, a little too lived in for the crowd outside. His shoes weren't polished, but they were clean. His tie slightly off-center, like he'd adjusted it too many times on the drive over, hoping it would make him feel more certain about coming. He looked around the kitchen, confused for a second. Then his eyes landed on me. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need explaining, the kind you give someone when you both understand something others don't talk about. He walked toward the small table, pulled out the chair across from me, and sat down without asking if it was taken. "They said they ran out of chairs," he said, voice low, a little dry with age, but not bitter, just worn. I nodded. A pause. Then he reached for a water glass and poured himself a drink from the same tap I had used earlier. No complaints, no commentary, just the quiet grace of someone used to being placed on the margins. And in that moment, we didn't need names. We didn't need explanations. We were two men who knew what it meant to build empires with bare hands, and then be told years later that the empire never needed us. He didn't ask why I was there. I didn't ask him either. We just sat, two ghosts in a house full of laughter. The clinks of silverware, the bright echo of toasts, the kind of hollow joy that only those inside the bubble can pretend is real. It all faded in the corners of the kitchen. We listened to it like distant thunder. From time to time, someone would pass the door. A flash of color, a whiff of perfume, the edge of a joke. They never looked in. Not once. It was like the kitchen had become a kind of exile, a purgatory for the forgotten, and yet somehow in his silence I felt less alone. He pulled something from his coat pocket, a small folded paper, unfolded it carefully as if it were delicate. Inside was a photograph. He didn't show it to me, just looked at it for a long moment, his fingers trembling a little at the edges. Then he folded it again, placed it back in his pocket. No words. But I understood. We both carried memories that didn't make it to the mantelpieces. After a while, he leaned back, eyes soft. Funny how the people we love most, he said almost to himself, sometimes forget the weight we carried to lift them. And I didn't respond, because he wasn't looking for an answer, and because there wasn't one. We sat like that for a long time. Two fathers, two hearts full of what-ifs and used-to-bes, the hum of the refrigerator behind us, the flickering shadows from the hallway lights ahead. And in that silence, I realized something painful and beautiful. It's not always the noise that tells the truth. Sometimes it's the silence, because silence never lies. It just waits for someone to finally hear it. Through the narrow crack of the kitchen door, the glow from the dining room spilled across the tile floor like liquid gold. I peered out and saw her, my daughter, radiant in the center of a circle of admirers. Her laughter rang clear and bright, a melody I once knew by heart, now perfect but distant. She lifted her glass, toasted her husband's success, praised his achievements, her every word soaring on applause that washed over the room like waves. I remembered that same laughter as a child, echoing through our tiny living room when she tumbled off the swing, brushing dirt from her jeans with a grin. I had caught her then, held her close, until the tears turned into giggles. I remembered how she practiced her first dance recital steps in our cramped kitchen, twirling until she nearly knocked over the sink, and I clapped until my hands ached. Now she stood beneath a chandelier I could never have afforded, surrounded by people who knew her as someone else's creation. She spoke of her husband's charity work, of his vision for the future, her voice strong and confident. Not once did her eyes break from her captivated audience to find me in the shadows. Not once did she see her father, the man who had mortgaged his dreams, sold his tools, and worked through nights to sow the seeds of her tomorrow. I pressed my forehead against the cool metal of the refrigerator, tasting the bitter truth on the back of my tongue. I raised her. I'd scraped together every spare dollar, send her to college, taken on extra shifts so she could chase hers. Every tuition payment, every late-night study session I quietly funded, every sacrifice I concealed behind a proud nod. It was all woven into the woman before that glittering crowd. Yet here I was, invisible, a shadow cast by my own creation. A waiter drifted past, carrying a tray of silver platters piled high with delicacies. The scents, seared scallops, truffle foam, microgreens, tugged at my senses. I swiveled back to my stool, the leather creaking under my weight. I pulled the bread tighter to my chest, the crumbly loaf a meager talisman of belonging. Its warmth was nothing like the warmth I once felt in her laughter, but it was all I had. I closed my eyes and let the noise become a distant hum, like the echo of a life I had built but could no longer inhabit. In that moment, the kitchen, though spotless and too vast, became a sanctuary for truth. Here I could remember everything she'd forgotten. The bedtime stories I read, the scraped knees I soothed, the nights I stared at her empty room praying she'd come home safe. I swallowed hard, the taste of stale bread mingling with old regrets. And though she continued to shine through that door, unseeing, untouching, I resolved something fierce in my chest. I would not remain a silent witness in the wings of her celebration. Not tonight, because even if the world she built no longer had room for me, my love, and the truth it carried, would find a way to break through the walls. The clamor of glasses rising in unison echoed through the open doorway, like a tide rolling in, unstoppable and insistent. I could feel the vibration of crystal against crystal, a chorus of voices swelling to the woman who built her life from nothing. A cheer burst forth, bright and triumphant, as if proclaiming that tonight, here in this perfect room, She had conjured her entire world out of thin air. But as their applause thundered, a hollow ache opened in my chest. Nothing from nothing? My hands tightened around the crust of bread, knuckles whitening, and the world tilted a little on its axis. I remembered the nights when I'd crawled into her bedroom to kiss her forehead, lingering by the doorway to listen to her soft breaths after she'd fallen asleep. I remembered the paycheck I refused to touch so that her first semester tuition was covered. I remembered every no I swallowed so she could say yes. They celebrated her independence, her strength, her triumph over adversity. They spoke as though she had risen alone, like some conquering hero who needed no guide, no foundation. Guardian angels half forgotten, ghosts of sacrifice unseen. The truth I carried, the truth of every sleepless night, every missed meal, every ache in my bones from double shifts, slipped away between their words. I watched them, their eyes bright, their hearts convinced they honored her, unaware that in their praise they erased me completely. My throat closed. A dryness spread through me that no water could soothe. The air in the kitchen felt denser, heavy with contradiction. Their celebration shone dazzlingly beyond the door. But here, in the back rooms of her life, the lights were dimmer. And I, the architect of her beginnings, stood unseen by the light they worshipped. I closed my eyes and pictured her tiny hands, the first time she wrapped them around my finger, trusting me to catch her if she fell. I recalled the trembling smile she gave when she opened the letter of acceptance to her dream school, before I left for another night shift to ensure it was more than just a dream. That man, I realized, was a phantom tonight, erased by a single toast that proclaimed she built everything from nothing. A slow, furious calm settled over me. If they believed she had nothing to stand on, then I would remind them, not in words shouted across the hall. Those voices were too loud, too certain of their own truth, but in action. Because building from nothing takes more than applause. It demands sacrifice. It demands love. And above all, it demands that someone remember who laid the first stone. I took a measured breath, steadied myself on the counter's edge, and felt the resolve rise in my bones. The toast had cut deeper than any blade, but it had also drawn blood worth shedding if it meant they would finally see. And with that, I straightened my shoulders, ready for whatever came next. I reached into my pocket and felt the familiar fold of a napkin I'd carried for weeks, cradling a piece of her childhood, a drawing so small it could have been swept away by a single breath. Unfolding it with trembling fingers, I revealed the scrawled lines of crayons, 2 stick figures, one towering, one tiny, hand in hand beneath the sun with a wide, crooked smile. Above them, in her uneven handwriting, the words, "Daddy is my hero." I held it up to the light of the overhead lamp, as if hoping the glow would rekindle the warmth I once felt hearing her call me that. The edges were frayed, corners soft with the passage of time, and with every moment I'd carried that napkin, I'd believed in the promise it represented, the promise that in her world, in her heart, I was more than a provider. I was a protector, an unwavering pillar. But here in the gleaming kitchen of her new life, I was reduced to a footnote, an afterthought, hired help, invisible. My hands bore the calluses of years spent crafting futures with brick and mortar. Yet tonight, they trembled as I refolded that precious scrap, concealing the testament of her love against my chest like a secret too fragile to share. Around me, the hum of appliances was steady and uncaring. The dishwasher whirred its mechanical song, its stainless steel shell reflecting my slumped silhouette back at me, a silent witness. Even this machine, built to scrub and shine without gratitude, seemed to hold more honor than I did in that moment. It performed its duty without question. I performed mine by simply sitting in a room I'd built, bearing the weight of absence. Memory is a double-edged thing. I could smell the damp earth of the backyard where she learned to ride her first bike, hear the tinny echo of laughter that followed every stumble. I could taste the sweetness of the cupcakes we baked together for her 7th birthday, the frosting smeared on our noses like war paint. I could feel the pulse of her small hand in mine, trusting me to guide her. All of that, every heartbeat, every sacrifice, had vanished behind a wall of pretense and pride. The kitchen's bright tiles and polished counters mocked me with their perfection, reminding me that nothing perfect ever grows without imperfect roots. And yet, as I folded the napkin once more, I realized the truth it carried was indelible. I slipped it back into my pocket, pressing it against my heart, and straightened. The drawing, the words, the memory of her calling me hero, they weren't for them. They were for me. A reminder that the foundation I laid was unshakable, even if the people who stood upon it chose to ignore its strength. I rose from the stool, the soft scrape of metal against tile sounding louder than any toast, any cheer. The crumbs of memory trailed behind me like a breadcrumb path only I could follow, leading me back to who I was and who I still had the power to be. Because a hero, once he saves a life, never truly fades away, no matter where he's seated. He rose so quietly that I almost didn't notice until his chair scraped the floor, and the hush of my heartbeat filled the kitchen. In that instant, he became more than a fellow outsider. He was a catalyst. He straightened his shoulders, smoothing the lapels of his gray suit as though preparing for battle, and without hesitation crossed the threshold into the brightness of her world. The laughter dimmed to murmurs as he tapped his glass against the edge of a table, the single clear note slicing through the room like a bell toll. Conversation stalled mid-word. Silverware paused in midair. The chandelier above seemed to hold its breath as all eyes swung toward him. He stood there, framed by the candlelight and her astonished face, and for the first time that night, the air between us and them was charged with possibility. In the quiet that followed, I felt time stretch. My stomach tightened. I remembered my own trembling the first time I presented her with a bicycle helmet, certain she'd learn to ride, certain I'd catch her if she fell. Now I watched this stranger summon courage for both of us. He looked out at the crowd, old friends polished by wine, new faces perfected by small talk, and in his gaze I saw the weight of years, of loyalty, of unspoken truths. He raised his glass, his voice low but unwavering as he spoke the words that shattered their carefully crafted illusion. I'd like to say something. Silence flooded the room. It was a silence that demanded to be heard, pregnant with the promise of revelation. She faltered at the edge of her control, her perfect mask quivering. The guests exchanged glances, suddenly off balance, their smiles fading like candle flames in a draught. I remained in the kitchen, but every nerve in my body was drawn toward that moment. I felt the pull of recognition in her eyes as she wondered who dared speak for the man she'd banished. The old man's chest rose and fell with slow determination, and I realized his words would carry the weight I could no longer bear in silence. And in that charged stillness, I found something I thought was lost. Hope. Because now someone else had noticed. Someone else was willing to stand in the light on my behalf. Someone else was brave enough to pierce the pretense and remind them all, her included, of the debt they owed. The room waited. I waited. And in that pregnant pause, I knew that everything was about to change. He cleared his throat, the single sound reverberating through the hush, like a stone dropped in still water. The chandeliers shimmered above us, casting fractured light across faces frozen in shock. I watched from the kitchen entrance as he unfolded himself, a silhouette of dignity against the glare, and spoke with a quiet authority that made every head turn. "I've known this family for years," he began, voice gentle yet firm, carrying the weight of countless untold stories. I could see her husband's lips parting in surprise, the same way mine had when I first learned how quickly success can forget its builders. "I've watched a girl grow into a woman," he continued, "and I've watched a man work in the shadows so she could stand in the light." The room seemed to tilt toward him as he took another breath, and I felt my own heart pounding so loudly I wondered if even they could hear it. He pointed a steady finger in my direction, and suddenly I was no longer a ghost in their midst. I was the heartbeat of every memory they'd forgotten to honor. "But I came tonight for one reason only," his words rolled like thunder across the polished floor, "to meet the man in the kitchen." The declaration hung in the air, charged and alive. Chairs scraped back as people leaned forward, drawn by the gravity of his gaze. I saw my daughter's face pale, her false smile faltering as her eyes locked onto mine for the first time all evening. The guests, once so confident, looked uncertain. Uncertain that they'd toasted the right person, uncertain that their world was built on solid ground. He let the moment stretch before delivering the blow that would crack their perfect veneer. "That man," he said, voice low and unwavering, "is the reason any of you are sitting here." In those words was every late paycheck, every aching muscle, every sleepless night I'd endured so she could thrive. In those words was my blood and bone, my sacrifice laid bare before an audience that had nearly forgotten me. And as the truth resounded in that silent hall, I felt something shift deep within. Not shame, not regret, but the fierce, unbreakable pride of a father who had finally been seen. He took a steady breath and began weaving their shared history aloud, his voice a thread pulling at the tapestry of that room's pretenses. "There was a man," he said, "who, when his daughter told him she wanted to go to college, walked into a pawn shop and laid down his most important tools, his livelihood, to cover her first semester's tuition." The words hung heavy in the air, each one a hammer strike on the fragile glass of their celebration. I watched their faces soften as he continued. Every night, after a day's work at the site, he returned home to sleep in the cold kitchen, just like the one you see behind me. Hands cracked, back aching, yet never once did he speak of his pain. His gaze swept the guests, lingering on the couple who had toasted her rise from nothing, and I could see the flicker of shame in their eyes. He spoke of the mornings she awoke to find him up before dawn, already at his bench, sanding a frame or laying bricks, so she would never know the price of her dreams. "He never complained," the old man said, voice thick with emotion, "because every ache was worth the look in her eyes when she walked across that stage." And then, with quiet authority that made the chandelier quiver, he delivered the truth they had all but erased. That man built more than houses. He built her. In that suspended moment, the room's warmth turned molten, and I saw my daughter's chest rise and fall as tears welled beneath her polished makeup. The guests shifted, as if waking from a long dream, their applause stilled by the weight of memories they'd almost forgotten. And I, no longer a shadow in the back, felt the first real light of recognition touch me, warming every scar and every sacrifice until my heart knew it had finally come home. The warmth of the room shifted, the radiant glow of celebration dimming like a sunset passing behind storm clouds. Her lips, always so practiced in their perfect curve, trembled for the first time, the polished mask cracking at the corners. I felt the air grow heavy as eyes once bright with admiration drifted away or dropped to polished shoes. The chandelier's light danced uncertainly on crystal glasses as whispers hushed into awkward silence, cutting through the grandeur like a knife. She stood at the center, framed by pillars of praise moments ago, now a lone figure caught between pride and regret. Her husband's hand hovered near hers, as if unsure whether to offer comfort or stay silent. The guests, many of whom she boasted about, averted their gaze. You could almost see the slow creep of shame threading through their expressions as they realized how easily they had been persuaded to celebrate only half the story. In that suspended heartbeat, time slowed. I watched her chest rise and fall unevenly, the breaths shallow as memories flooded her mind. The late-night rides home in the back of my truck, the rough wood of the kitchen table on which she'd spread her textbooks, my calloused hands smoothing the pages for her. All those moments, unseen but never forgotten, crowded the space between us, demanding recognition. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. The air pressed in around her, urging a confession she wasn't ready to voice. The laughter and clinking crystal had vanished, replaced by the quiet truth of her neglect. And there, in the fragile hush of a fractured celebration, she finally felt the weight of every sacrifice she had dismissed. As the old man stepped back, lowering his glass with a reverence that spoke volumes, a ripple ran through the room, first a single hush, then hesitant movements. As one by one, guests began to rise from their seats, it wasn't for her anymore. They were turning away from the glittering facade they'd built, compelled instead to honor the man they'd forgotten. Chairs scraped against marble, gowns whispered across the floor, a dozen pairs of eyes shifted toward the kitchen doorway. In that instant, I felt every ache in my shoulders transform into something fierce and unbreakable. My legs carried me forward without thought, and I stepped into the soft glow of the dining room, my back straighter than it had been in years. The worth of a lifetime of sacrifice pulsed through me with each heartbeat. And as they stood, old friends, distant acquaintances, even her husband, I felt the hush of regret and recognition fill the space between us. No longer a shadow, no longer unseen, I met their eyes with quiet pride. And in that shared silence, each nod and lifted glass spoke a truth more powerful than any toast. They saw me. The plate arrived like a quiet apology, carried on trembling hands rather than polished trays. The young woman, her assistant, stepped into the kitchen doorway, her eyes filled with shame and something softer, empathy. She placed a simple meal before me, warm bread, a slice of roasted chicken, bright vegetables, and in that small, unspoken gesture, she bridged the chasm between rejection and redemption. I looked up at her, closing my eyes for a moment to taste the kindness in the steam rising from the plate, the first warmth I had felt all evening. Almost immediately, footsteps followed. A woman in a silken dress paused by the sink, then retrieved a delicate appetizer from her own hand, disappearing around the corner with the same quiet resolve. A gentleman in a tailored suit returned with a glass of water and a slice of dessert balanced on a napkin. Soon a steady stream of plates moved from dining table to kitchen counter, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. They had finally seen the man whose hands built not only walls and roofs, but the very foundation of a family's future. In that gentle procession, the kitchen transformed, no longer a place of exile, but a sanctuary of truth and belonging. And as I lifted each offering to my lips, I felt not just the satisfaction of a meal, but the balm of recognition healing decades-old wounds, proof that when people truly see one another, compassion follows, and even the coldest heart can be warmed. The last footsteps echoed softly as she slipped through the kitchen doorway, her elegant dress brushing against the tile floor, her eyes shimmering with tears that clung to her pride like fragile jewels. She paused for a moment at the threshold, as if the sight of me, no longer hidden in shadows, but seated at the heart of the room, took her breath away. The hush that fell around us was heavier than any toast, richer than any applause, carrying the weight of every unspoken word between father and daughter. I watched her shoulders tremble, watched the world we once shared flicker back to life in her gaze, and when she finally found her voice, it came as a whisper, "Dad." She didn't need to say more for everything to be understood. Her apology lay in that single syllable, in the colors running down her cheeks, in the way her ribcage rose and fell, as if she were learning to breathe again in the presence of the man she'd nearly forgotten. I rose from my seat, the chair I had once thought was mine and hers alone, reaching instead for a sturdier, more honored place at the table. With a gentle gesture, I pulled out a chair, not in the cold kitchen corner, but at my table of reclaimed dignity, its wood grain warmed by memory and love. As she sank into that seat, the room seemed to shift around us. Guests retreated respectfully, offering silent bows of respect as plates and glasses were set aside. The lights felt softer, the air more intimate, as if the house itself exhaled in relief. And in that instant, celebration found its true shape, not in grand speeches or curated perfection, but in the simple act of welcoming each other home. Our eyes met across the table, and without another word we understood that this reunion of hearts, was the real celebration, the one built on the foundations of sacrifice, forgiveness, and love that had never truly left us.